With us is Mr. Charles Cullen, and we are here today for the purpose of obtaining a voluntary tape statement from Mr. Cullen pertaining to the death of Reverend Florian Gall. What was your intent when you withdrew this? Why were you drawing this out?
My intent was to give it to the Reverend Gall.
For what reason?
So he would pass away.
A family received terrible news on June 28th of 2003. Despite showing signs of recovery from pneumonia in the past few days, Reverend Florian Gall had died from a heart attack at the Somerset Medical Center in Somerville, New Jersey. Since there had been signs of improvement before the 68-year-old suddenly passed away, an autopsy was performed. The hospital discovered his blood contained very high levels of a drug meant to treat heart disease, a drug he didn't need. Why the Reverend was given this drug to treat a case of pneumonia made no sense, but this was the second unexplained death in similar circumstances that had taken place in just a matter of days. An investigation on these unexplained deaths of patients led to a terrifying discovery. Charles Cullen, the nurse assigned to these and many other patients, had been administering all sorts of unnecessary drugs that were only deteriorating their health more. But this was not the first hospital in which he had been tampering with a patient's recoveries. Since the 80s, Cullen had murdered dozens of patients through his twisted ways. Although he pleaded guilty to 29 murders, the real number of victims is potentially closer to 400. This is the story of Charles Cullen, the serial killer nurse who used the vulnerability of sick patients to fulfill his darkest desires. On February 22nd of 1960, Charles Edmund Cullen was born into a working-class family in West Orange, New Jersey. His mother stayed home taking care of Charles and his 7 older siblings, while his father worked as a bus driver. When he was just a baby, Charles lost his father, and years later, when he was 17, his mother died in a car accident. Charles had what has been described as a miserable childhood, and all through his life, he would attempt to take his own life many times. The youngest would be at age 9, when he drank the chemicals from a chemistry set. After losing his mother to the car accident, 17-year-old Charles dropped out of school and joined the US Navy. During his time assigned to a submarine, he became interested in assisting the medical team with administering vaccines or assisting in treating patients. In 1984, he was discharged from the Navy for medical reasons, but Charles was still interested in the medical field, so he enrolled in the Mountainside Hospital School of Nursing in New Jersey. In 1987, he graduated and began working as a nurse at the burn unit of the St. Barnabas Medical Center. He also got married to Adrian Taub, with whom he had 2 daughters. During his time at St. Barnabas, Charles killed his first victim. John Yengo had been admitted to the hospital after suffering an allergic reaction to blood-thinning medicine. Despite being treated for the allergy, he unexpectedly died. Another patient being treated for HIV suddenly died as well. He had been administered insulin he didn't need. Many other deaths took place in strange circumstances, and in all cases, unnecessary drugs seemed to be inserted into the patient's IVs. The nurse in charge of them was always Charles Cullen, so when the hospital started an investigation, he decided to leave the job. Despite strongly suspecting that Charles had tampered with the IV bags, the hospital took no further action against him, and in 1992, he went on to work at the Warren Hospital in Phillipsburg. Charles and Adrian's marriage wouldn't last long. Soon after having their first daughter in 1987, Adrian noticed that Charles became cruel, violent, and unpredictable. She said he mistreated the family dogs and was becoming more violent towards her and their children. In 1990, they had their second daughter, and in 1993, Adrian got a restraining order out of fear that Charles was going to hurt them. In 1994, they got divorced, and Adrian took her daughters away, cutting all ties with Charles. During this time, he was also arrested for breaking into the apartment of a woman he dated. However, none of these arrests or sudden changes in workplace raised any red flags, and Charles continued to be hired as a nurse. At the time, there was a nationwide need for medical staff, so nobody looked into Charles's record too deeply. After Warren Hospital, he worked at the intensive care unit of Hunterdon Medical Center in Flemington. Then he found a job at the Morristown Memorial Hospital, where he was fired in August of 1997 for poor performance. He later moved on to the Liberty Nursing and Rehabilitation Center in Allentown, Pennsylvania. More hospitals followed after that, and in many cases, he would leave behind a series of unexplained or sudden deaths of patients in his care. But once again, Charles would soon move to the next hospital, and no trace of his records seemed to make it to the hands of his future employers, so no investigations followed up on these suspicious deaths. During these years, he also attempted to take his own life multiple times. Although he was never successful and always recovered, the hospitals were never notified of his mental health struggles. In 2002, Charles Cullen was working at the St. Luke's Hospital in Pennsylvania. Many unexplained deaths had taken place, all under Charles Cullen's care, and fellow nurses were getting suspicious. Suspicions were even stronger when a nurse discovered a stash of unused medications that had been stolen from the hospital. None of these medications could be sold or used for recreational purposes, therefore it made no sense for anyone to steal them. An investigation revealed it had been Charles who had been taking out all of these drugs, and he had also been present at several of the deaths. However, he was just fired for theft, and no further investigation was held in relation to the unexpected death of patients. In 2003, Somerset Medical Center in Somerville, New Jersey, hired Charles with no background check. This is where he was believed to commit most of his confirmed murders. During his time at Somerset, not only did Charles become less careful, but he also began treating patients that were not assigned to him. He would enter a patient's room and administer drugs into their IV bag without even checking their chart. In July of 2003, the hospital began suspecting an angel of death was active among the staff, since there had been numerous suspicious overdoses. Reverend Florian Gall's death had raised all the red flags, and the hospital was trying to get to the bottom of it. However, the authorities were not involved until October, leaving Charles 3 more months to continue killing unsuspecting patients. He was fired for stealing the drugs, but the investigation had just started. Once the authorities were notified, an official criminal investigation began to discover if Charles really was the nurse behind all these mysterious deaths. The police required help from someone who was very close to him, Amy Loughran. Amy was a single mother and suffered from a heart condition she had not disclosed in her interview, since she really needed the job to raise her children. Charles and Amy became close while working long shifts, and he even helped her and covered for her when she suffered from her condition. Amy thought Charles was a close friend, but immediately suspected something wasn't right when she saw the record of medication withdrawals. These were medications with the potential to kill if administered improperly, and there was no reason for Charles's patients to be taking them. So Amy agreed to help out investigators by wearing a wire and getting a confession out of Charles. Amy and Charles met at a restaurant, like they usually did. Through careful questions, Amy managed to get enough out of Charles to get him arrested on probable cause. The serial killer had finally been caught, but investigators were not ready for what they were about to discover.
We're here this afternoon in the Major Crimes Unit interview room. With us is Mr. Charles Cullen, and we are here today for the purpose of obtaining a voluntary tape statement from Mr. Cullen pertaining to the death of Reverend Florian Gall, which occurred at Somerset Medical Center on June 28th of 2003. We are also here to speak to Mr. Cullen in reference to several other deaths that occurred at Somerset Medical Center and other medical and healthcare facilities. You understand you've been charged with 2 crimes, correct?
Murder and attempted murder.
Murder and attempted murder. Let's talk about the matter pertaining to Florian Gall. Are you responsible for his death?
Yes, I am.
And why is that, Charlie?
Because I injected him with a medication called digoxin.
And what was your intent when you withdrew this? Why were you drawing this out?
My intent was to give it to the Reverend Gall.
For what reason?
So so he would pass away.
Charles Cullen confessed to killing about 30 patients since he began working in medical centers, but he mentions there could have been many more. Just how many is impossible to know. Many of the deaths happened among sick patients of an older age, and autopsies are not usually performed on older patients unless there is suspicion of other causes of death. Some place the real number of victims as high as 400. The Angel of Death explained these were mercy kills. His patients were too sick to recover, and he was trying to spare them the suffering. However, in most of the cases investigated, the patients were not terminally ill, nor suffering. Many of them were even recovering, or in the hospital for minor illnesses. Charles Cullen was charged with 29 murders, and he pled guilty to all of them as part of a plea deal to avoid him the death penalty.
You are hereby sentenced to New Jersey State Prison to 2 consecutive life sentences, which, with the application of the No Early Release Act, that is NJSA 2C:43-7.2, mandates a period of 85%, or approximately 127 and a half years of parole ineligibility.
He's currently serving a life sentence at the New Jersey State Prison and will not get the possibility of parole. The most astonishing thing about this case is how Charles was able to move from one hospital to the next, leaving behind a trail of suspicious deaths but never being formally investigated. No background checks were held upon hiring new personnel. No authorities had been involved until 2003 despite being fired for tampering with patient IV bags. All of this negligence from the hospitals enabled Charles to continue killing innocent patients. There were never any consequences to his actions, and this is why he became even more careless and obvious over the years. After Charles Cullen was charged with the murder of 29 patients, the US legal system revisited its legislations in regards to medical attention in hospitals. New laws were passed to enforce harsher penalties for hospitals that didn't alert authorities of any suspicious behavior. Background checks also became mandatory for any new hirings in hospital staff. If all of these laws had existed and been followed while Charles was working, most of his deaths would have been avoided. Unfortunately, the concept of an angel of death is more common than we think. There are many cases of doctors, nurses, and other caregivers who abuse their power and the vulnerability of their patients to play God with their lives. However, thanks to cross-checking and safety protocols in hospitals, they are far less common now than 20 years ago when Charles Cullen was arrested. These are the 29 identified victims who were murdered by Charles Cullen. The rest of them we just have to remember anonymously.